A poll conducted by Zogby in May of 2006 found that 42% of Americans now believe the U.S. government and the 9/11 Commission concealed or refused to investigate critical evidence that contradicts the official explanation of the September 11th attacks, saying there's been a cover-up.
The official story about 9/11 is a gigantic conspiracy theory that 19 Arab Muslims, under the guidance of Osama bin Laden, defeated the world's most sophisticated military defense system, and also, in bringing down the World Trade Center, defeated many of the basic laws of physics. So that is the basic conspiracy theory, and what we in the movement are doing is challenging that conspiracy theory.
David Ray Griffin is the leading critic of the official story of 9/11. He's a professor of theology at Claremont School of Theology and the author of several controversial books outlining his beliefs, books that have now sold more than 100,000 copies.
What we need is a genuine investigation. We have more of a criminal investigation if the local 7-Eleven is robbed.
For example, why did George W. Bush wait 441 days before reluctantly setting up the bipartisan commission that investigated what happened that day? And why did he give it so little money to function?
The government was willing to spend $30 million on a blowjob, but you had to fight to get an investigation into the biggest, what could have been the biggest atrocity and biggest screw-up, or worse, in American history.
Even Lee Hamilton, the co-chair of the 9/11 Commission itself, admits to us that the process he headed up was seriously flawed.
So there are all kinds of reasons. We thought we were set up to fail. We got started late. We had a very short time frame. Indeed, we had to get it extended. We did not have enough money. They were afraid we were going to hang somebody, that we would point the finger.
Is one of the reasons why these guys aren't getting funded and it's so late is that someone's got something to hide?
There is, well, a lot of people have things to hide.
Well, who in this case?
Well, look, you can go down the list and probably identify 100 people who made mistakes that day.
What were their errors?
They didn't pay enough attention to terrorism.
When the 9/11 Commission report came out, I discovered that they simply ignored about 99% of all of that evidence, and the other 1% they dealt with by distorting it.
But for every question you leave unanswered, you create an opening for a conspiracy theory, and a good many of them have popped up here.
So what do the so-called conspiracy theorists say? Let's start with their first major target, the collapse of the Twin Towers. Critics say the buildings would not have collapsed as quickly and as easily as they did without explosives involved.
A gravity-driven pancake collapse just cannot account for what we saw in the morning of 9/11. It simply defies all logic.
Claim 2, fire would not cause the buildings of this type to collapse.
On February 23, 1991, a 38-story skyscraper in Philadelphia, built in 1973, burned for more than 19 hours and spread over 8 floors. It did not collapse.
Fire or fire plus externally caused damage has never in history brought down steel frame high-rise buildings. So it would be quite a miracle if 3 were brought down on one day in New York.
Claim 3, video evidence of controlled demolition explosions, the so-called squibs.
Explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 here.
The first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building.
And finally, witnesses testify to hearing explosions inside the buildings.
federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device.
We received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off.
So, given all these questions, were the World Trade Centers brought down by explosives?
The charge that dynamite or whatever brought down the World Trade Towers, we of course looked at very carefully. We find no evidence of that. You find all kinds of evidence that it was the airplanes that did it.
But if critics like Griffin don't trust Lee Hamilton, what about an established technical magazine like Popular Mechanics?
Every time we got down to the core facts that conspiracy theorists themselves cite, they turned out to be just mistaken.
Obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center.
And how does Jim Meigs say the buildings collapsed?
It's true that no building like that had collapsed solely due to fire, but it wasn't solely due to fire. You had massive impacts of jets that tore out the superstructure, the vertical tubular frames on the outside, damaged the internal core, and then essentially cooked the concrete and steel truss floor assemblies until they started to sag and buckle, and the steel, as it heated, gradually lost strength and began to sag with all the weight of the floors overhead until it failed.
What about the so-called exploding squibs?
We talked to the major demolition firms in this country. They told us that the puffs of dust and pulverized concrete and sheetrock you see coming out of some of the windows, in some cases even below the collapse site, is very typical of a building collapse.
And finally, what about the witnesses who say they heard explosions?
We talked to Vincent Dunn, the former deputy fire chief for the city of New York. He told us in any major fire, you have stuff going off all the time. Aerosol cans will explode. Rooms that have fuel vapor in them, if they're suddenly exposed to oxygen, will suddenly explode.
Well, the debate about whether explosives brought down the Twin Towers rages on. The second target of the so-called conspiracy theorists is the mysterious collapse of World Trade Center Building 7.
Later that evening at 5:20, World Trade Center 7, a 47-story office building 300 feet away from the North Tower, suddenly collapses. The building's tenants included the CIA, Department of Defense, IRS, Secret Service, and Rudy Giuliani's emergency bunker.
They conveniently ignore building number 7. No plane hit building 7, and yet it came down in essentially the same way, free fall speed, virtually free fall speed, and straight down.
I don't know specifically if it's in the report. I can't recall that it is.
Right, I don't think it's in the report.
Okay. Then I'll accept your word for that.
There was a decision not to put it in the report.
I do not recall that there was a specific discussion in the Commission and we rejected the idea of putting Building 7 in. I don't recall that. So I presume the report was written without reference to Building 7 at all, because all of the attention, of course, was on the Trade Tower buildings.
But serious attention is now turning to what happened to Building 7. On August 30th, 2006, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, whose reports were used extensively by the 9/11 Commission itself, issued a fact sheet on Building 7 that suddenly lends some credibility to the critics' allegations. They say, quote, NIST is also considering whether hypothetical blast events could have played a role in initiating the collapse. NIST does stress that they have found, quote, no evidence of a blast or controlled demolition event. Still, their interest in blast events relating to Building 7 is hard to ignore.
Now, to a scientist, or journalist, or historian, that should mean this is an opportunity to learn more. Let's find out as much as we can. To a conspiracy theorist, it means, aha, if you can't prove how that building came down, there's only one other option. Somebody blew it up.
You've obviously gone through the report with a fine-tooth comb. You're raising a lot of questions. I can do the same thing.
Yeah.
All I want from you is evidence. I cannot answer every question with regard to 9/11. I can answer a good many of them, but I can't answer them all.
I guess, Mr. Hamlin, I don't think anyone expects you to have all the answers.
Well, you apparently do, because you've asked me questions of enormous detail from a great variety of sources.
Every day I get another email or another phone call, or I talk to a rescue worker or a person who worked at the Pentagon. You know, you just talk to so many people who were involved who, in one way or another, want a new investigation.
I don't believe for a minute that we got everything right. We wrote a first draft of history. people will be investigating 9/11 for the next 100 years in this country. And they're going to find out some things that we miss.